Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of MDIC Live, a fireside chat style series highlighting the latest happenings within the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and the medical device and regulatory science space as a whole. Today, as you can see, we have a little bit of a different setup for today's show. I'm joined in person by Eileen Mihas, Program Director for EFS at MDIC, and Keondae Ervin, Senior Project Manager for Clinical Sciences and Technology. They're going to be leading today's discussion around early feasibility studies in the United States, some of the challenges behind conducting these studies, some of the opportunities to conducting these studies, and what really motivates this initiative at MDIC to drive US-based EFS studies forward. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
Thank you for being here. And before we join in and dive into today's topic, I want to remind those of you that are watching us live on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook that this is an interactive session. Excuse me. And so we appreciate all your feedback and your comments in the comment section. Feel free to leave your questions for today's guest, and we may just get to them at the end of today's show. Now, to dive in, I want to introduce you all to our audience here. So Eileen, I'll start with you. Tell us about your experiences, tell us about yourself and your role here at MDIC.
Sure. Again, thanks for having us. I'm excited to talk about the Early Feasibility Studies initiative. So my name is Eileen Mihas. I'm the Program Director at MDIC for the Early Feasibility Studies program. And my background is mainly in clinical nursing. So I'm a registered nurse. I've been a nurse for about 15 to 16 years. I have extensive background in critical care, clinical research, structural heart valve coordination, as well as throughout the interventional platform. So in structural heart, both pediatrics and adults, and then electrophysiology and cardiac cath lab experience. And so I came to MDIC just a few months ago, and part of my role here is to drive MDIC's mission of accelerating the medical device technology and the regulatory pathways and regulatory science, and specifically in the feasibility study program. And we do this by collaborating with all stakeholders, so people in industry, the FDA, as well as clinical sites, and bring everybody together within a safe space to be able to delineate the barriers to performing early feasibility studies in the United States.
Thank you for being here. And Keondae, same question to you. Introduce yourself to today's audience. Tell us about yourself, your previous experiences, and your role here at MDIC.
Thanks so much, Devin. Hi, everyone. My name is Keondae Ervin, Senior Project Manager at MDIC in the Early Feasibility Studies program. My previous background, I worked in contract management for funded research studies and negotiating terms and conditions of projects and reviewing budgets for studies that were very small and up to very large pragmatic clinical trials. And I also had the opportunity to work at a managed care organization that provided health insurance for Medicaid members as well as Medicare. And in that role, I was truly a liaison to the providers that had issues with claims that had been submitted, what things were, being rejected, those type of things, and any questions or concerns or even issues with authorizations for procedures, things of that nature. And then coming to MDIC, I've been with MDIC a little over 3 years now, and before joining the EFS program, I was part of the NEST initiative, where I was a project manager for a large portfolio of pilot projects. So really seeing those projects from start to finish in the real world evidence space, really testing the environment to see if, some of these data points within clinical research organizations, truly, fit the mold there, and then had the opportunity to join the Early Feasibility Studies program. So it's been a great experience thus far. And then in my role as a senior project manager is really, truly supporting Eileen in those day-to-day functions, working with our stakeholders. And then, if we're ever, hosting any sort of events, which you'll get a plug about that later in the program. But there's a lot of work that goes into that. So really providing that operational expertise and support and just, planning those events and any type of, things internal to the department, building out dashboards, things like that. So it's really that operational function.
Thank you for being here, and thank you to you both again for joining us for today's show. It's definitely interesting to hear your diverse range of experiences have led you or brought you to the EFS initiative here at MDIC. And without further ado, we're going to dive into exactly what is EFS. Eileen, I'm going to pose this question to you. Could you define what early feasibility studies are for us and what the role of some of these studies are in the clinical trial process?
Sure. So the early feasibility studies, it's a small clinical study offered in devices in early stage within the development. So where you might need some flexibility in the design. And it's about 10 to 15 patients. And what it offers is early data on safety as well as trends in efficacy. And then also, if you enroll 1 to 2 patients, you have the flexibility to pause your study, potentially redesign the device and move forward without any kind of penalty throughout the regulatory pathway or any slowing down.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of benefits to conducting these types of studies, but Keondae, I've heard that these aren't yet commonplace in the United States. Can you tell us why that is and what some of the challenges to conducting these types of studies in the US are?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few main themes and then, some smaller themes, but I think the main theme really what it boils down to is time and money. These medical device companies, want these devices to be in the patient as soon as possible so they can start getting, results. And if they need to change the device or, based on some of those outcomes. And right now in the United States, it's a little hard to get those devices in those patients quickly. It really boils down to the budgeting and the contracting. When these medical device companies work, with these clinical sites that will be performing the clinical study. So it's sometimes easier to do these studies outside of the U.S. where those things can be negotiated and completed much quicker so that the device can go into the patient. So these device companies, it just makes more sense to do that. And, until we really, get that awareness of the EFS program, in the United States, which is part of our initiative, and to figure out those, pinpoints and make that timeline a little bit shorter, so that, we can get these contracts negotiated and these budgets negotiated in a much quicker effort. And, when we have these, and that's part of our toolkit that we've developed, which we'll talk about that, later, which makes it easier to streamline the process.
And, thank you for sharing that. And the question I think for a lot of our viewers is going to be why continue to promote US-based EFS, and why is it the goal of this initiative to drive US-based EFS studies forward in spite of all these challenges? Eileen, could you speak to that motivation?
Yeah, so the drive really is because there's a human cost associated with not performing early feasibility studies in the US. Our patients are getting delayed care, delayed access to innovative therapies. And to go back to the big watershed moment as to why we started pushing this back to drive it back to the US is in 2011, the Edwards Sapien heart valve was approved in the United States. And it was approved in the United States 4 years after approval in Europe, and then 10 years after first in man was done, that's 4 years that our patients in the United States did not have access to this innovative therapy. So the FDA really took notice of that and developed a guidance in 2013, kind of taking out a lot of the red tape and bureaucratic and administrative level issues. And we're really able to speed up the process from upwards of what it was taking a year for an IDE to get approved. Now it's within a 30 to 60 day cycle. And like Keondae was saying, part of what, as the initiative has gone on over the years, we saw that improve, but now we're seeing issues with contracting and budgeting. So what we're really trying to do is streamline the process to promote and re-educate investigators and clinical sites on the benefits and how important it is to do a EFS in the United States.
Thank you for that. And I want to highlight one thing that Keondae mentioned, which is the EFS Toolkit. So the EFS initiative, to my understanding, has a plethora of these resources available freely and openly on MDIC's website. I want to take a deep dive into some of those resources that have come out of this initiative. But first, Eileen, could you tell us what inspired some of these resources, and what were some of the gaps that you saw in the industry that some of these resources could look to solve?
So that's what, as I was saying earlier, I think that it was that watershed moment as to really why we're pushing it back and wanting to move the pendulum back to the United States. And then a lot of the gaps that we're seeing now is some both perceived and real barriers to completing EFS in the US. And what we want to do is share best practices. We work with the stakeholders are very passionate about what they do, and it creates a safe space for them to collaborate and really come up with processes and ideas to streamline and really improve the entire clinical trial ecosystem.
Cool. Keondae, same question to you. Tell us about some of the resources that have come out of this initiative, and what are some of the goals of the resources that you all have put out?
Yeah, so two of the main components, I'll say the Master Clinical Trial Agreement, which, this was started, I believe, in 2018, where a group of lawyers just came together in one room and hashed out a standardized template that was really geared towards early feasibility study. And, these contracts probably, I think, are about 90% of the way, which left only 10% to negotiate. And that's, monumental when it comes to negotiating contracts, where if you start a contract from scratch, it's going to take a very long time, where all these pieces are already, plugged in. And, what's great about this is that, this agreement has gone through multiple iterations, and, having that collaborative effort across the ecosystem. We've had feedback from clinical sites, experts in the field, the clinicians, the lawyers from these clinical sites and organizations. So getting all this feedback, we were able to tweak these agreements so that, truly there are only a few items that you really truly need to negotiate based on, the clinical sites, standards. And another document, our informed patient consent form, again, also very critical to these types of studies, which lays out all the the foundation for the patient, what they're going to experience in the trial, and what their role is, and their rights and responsibilities. So that very important, and very critical to make sure the patient is engaged and aware of what's going on. So that document, very critical, as well as the contract to the success of an early feasibility study, and then even a pivotal trial. And I'll say that too, what I think is great is because what happens after early feasibility study, you have this trial in this small amount of population, and then the next, monumental task is a much larger trial. So you can get those the longitudinal data of the device and the outcomes and things like that. And what's great is, our agreement, is multifaceted, and that can be applied to the master clinical trial agreement. And, you just take out a few things, you adjust the budget or the, the project plan. So these documents and agreements are very versatile.
And it sounds like there's a lot of impact to the things that you all have put out. It sounds like there's a great use for them out in this space from what you all have been experiencing and studying early feasibility studies. Keondae, I want to go back to you. And if you could tell us more about how can clinicians use some of these tools to move EFS forward in the United States?
Yeah, so it really starts from the foundation. Once you have these contracts in place, or you begin the negotiation, it's a lot faster to consult with the patients, that may have a dire need for this device where this may be their only option. And that's what it really is all about, is the patient and making sure they get that level of care that, they truly deserve. So, having these device or these agreements in place, or using these elements of the toolkit, will get that standard of care to begin a lot faster. And I think that really plays a great role in helping these clinicians really get the patients on board and to treat them. So I think that's great. And then also with the patient informed consent, that's already there, so that should these patients have any questions, and it's their right to have questions, so that they can be fully informed about the trial and the device. So having everything kind of laid out in the process makes it easier, for a clinician to be able to, really focus on what's going to happen during the trial, and things, any type of outcomes that could happen, any adverse events. So you can really focus on the patient for that trial, rather than saying, we just started building this contract out, and then, well, you may not get that standard of care for another 6 or 12 months, which then that becomes a problem.
Right. And it sounds like there's no shortage of challenges to address within the EFS space. But you guys seem to be having a good handle on it and knowing the different areas where there could be improvement, and putting out resources toward that. I want to talk a little bit about how these resources come together and the mechanism through which MDIC kind of puts out work. Within this initiative, there are 2 steering committees, cardiovascular and neurovascular. Eileen, can you tell us what's interesting about these 2 focus areas?
Sure. So within the cardiovascular committees, it started off in structural heart. That was the space where they've had a successful budgeting practices workshop and sharing best practices workshop. And really they did move the needle, and like approximately half of the structural heart EFS are being conducted in the United States. And then really in the neurovascular space, and specifically in electrophysiology, they took notice that there's a lot of innovative products being made, and they are typically doing all of their early feasibility studies outside of the US. So these were 2 areas that MDIC and the EFS program were able to hone in on, and were able to collaborate with a lot of the industry members who really want to move to EFS back to the United States for multiple reasons. So it's really a large commitment. This is all volunteer based from the people in the working groups and on the committees. And the physicians really want to move this forward and streamline the process, and really emphasis on workflow and decreasing all of that red tape. And like Keondae was saying with the master clinical trial agreement, if your institution is able to take that to your legal department and they're able to get comfortable with it, and then that process, the timeline to get everything completed for contracting and budgeting and negotiating can be decreased.
So that process that you outlined is perfectly indicative of, I think, what's super special about MDIC as a whole, and bringing together various stakeholders to address some of these regulatory challenges. And I think that's especially beneficial in this department and this initiative's work. Keondae, I'm going to pose a similar question to you. How do these committees drive overall EFS efficiency forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the biggest theme is, it's really a collaborative space. So with that, our initiatives, the electrophysiology initiative and the neurovascular initiative, you will have clinicians, you'll have electrophysiologists, or you will have, neurosurgeons in these groups. And then you've also got the folks that, are doing the day-to-day, clinical operations. And then you'll also have, some thought leaders from the medical device companies as well. And, you will even have in some of these committees, some of our government agencies, from the FDA, and you'll have those experts from there. And it's just a great think tank to really tackle some of the ideas tackle some of the issues that are, happening in early feasibility and, really driving the initiative forward. And I think it's great that, these our stakeholders in these committees are just so passionate about early feasibility studies, and they want to bring it in the United States. The whole theme, it's always about the patient. So, you've got these groups that are so passionate. So it's how do we make it happen? How do we make it happen faster? How do we make it happen more efficient? So just having everyone in the same room is just, it's really miraculous to really drive some of these initiatives.
And it sounds like it's certainly an empowering group to be a part of. It's certainly empowering to be a part of a collaborative organization that works toward some of the challenges that a lot of folks in these groups are facing themselves or have been through. So it definitely sounds like it's helpful. For anyone who agrees with that point and has been watching and they say, I really want to get involved in this initiative. Eileen, can you tell us how?
Sure. Yeah. And then I just want to reiterate that, the whole medical device ecosystem, it's a purpose-driven industry. And the more energy we have towards it and the more voices is, how we're going to be able to get the word out. So at the end of this live segment, we're going to share my information, as well as Keondae's. And we will also be having, for anybody industry or anybody interested, clinical sites in early feasibility studies, in a workshop, a best practices workshop on February 1st. It's the evening before the AF Symposium in Boston. And so it's going to be from 1 to 5:30. We'll have a cocktail hour after that. And then we will actually have the FDA as a keynote speaker for dinner. And we will be kind of promoting that and sending out registration within the next couple of weeks. So that's another way to get involved.
Nice. And certainly stay in touch, stay in tune with when we drop that registration information, and definitely visit mdic.org to hear about any of the free EFS resources and tools that you've heard about during today's session. We're going to be dropping Eileen and Keondae's contact information in the comment section in case you want to get in touch. But before we end today's show, I want to thank you all for being here today and sharing EFS with us and the ins and outs of your initiative. And I thank everyone at home for watching, and stay tuned for another episode of MDIC Live in the future. Thank you, everyone.